Hello, I'm Jason Carter. I'm the chair of the Carter Center's Board of Trustees, and it is a great honor for me to be here. I appreciate enormously the McCain Institute's partnership with the Carter Center and its leadership in terms of driving character-driven leadership and core democratic principles over these last few months and years where we've deeply needed it. And I know that we will continue it into the future. So thank you to the McCain Institute. In addition, Secretary Albright, it is a great honor for me to be here with you. You have done so much for our country and our world, but you have also done so much for me personally, for my family, for the Carter Center. And so it's a real personal thrill for me to be here as well. How are you, and welcome.
Well, I'm fine, and I'm delighted to be able to do this with you, Jason. And I'm obviously very happy to have a good discussion about the Carter Center, but I wanted to also point out, I did quite a lot of work with Senator McCain. He was at the International Republican Institute and I at the National Democratic Institute. And we spent a lot of time, obviously, traveling and doing democracy work together. And so I'm delighted that they are also part of this conversation in sponsoring it with you.
Well, and I'm honored again to be here with you. And I know that your experience in democracy building and in those core democratic principles that the McCain Institute is so focused on, has been a signature of your career. And one of the things I was talking to my grandfather before this about his role in driving human rights as part of American foreign policy. And I just was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking for a minute about the role of human rights in our foreign policy and how we use those concepts to project ourselves and our ideals sort of around the world.
Well, I'm very glad to talk about that because it is a major aspect of how I think the United States needs to act and present itself. And it was my honor to work in the Carter administration when that issue was front and center in so many ways. And there were some people who kind of thought, well, this is too idealistic to just kind of be talking about human rights. Who cares? But it is central to who we are. And it is very important for us to project why we care about that. And the interesting part, there's always this discussion about whether our foreign policy should be idealistic or realistic. And I always think it's a false dichotomy, mainly because I couldn't figure out whether I was an idealistic realist or a realistic idealist. But I was working for Zbigniew Brzezinski at the time in the White House, and he was a picture of a realist with idealistic inclinations. And he thought that the human rights policy was a very strong and important part of literally our arsenal as we were talking about how the United States could behave in that particular period. So I think it was one of a truly landmark policy, and something that I know that anybody that had anything to do with the Carter administration is very proud to know that it was a central aspect of our national security policy.
And it's interesting that you said national security policy, and you talk about the realist benefits of thinking and talking about our ideals and our human rights and living them out. What we have watched over the last year and more, in many ways, our democracy and the way we live up to our democratic and human rights ideals become an international discussion in new ways. Some of them are attacks on our democratic system that we have seen. Some is, of course, in the last summer, the reawakening on issues of race in the country. This is a big question, but where do you begin when you start to look at the last year that the United States has had and the way that our internal discussions impact our ability to drive our national security interests across the world?
Well, there's no way to talk about it except say, what a year. And so many different things have happened that are affecting how we feel about each other, how we think of what the role of government is these days in the United States, what our position is internationally. And I think it has made people question some very basic aspects of our society. And I do think that's not bad, frankly. I think that we shouldn't be taking anything for granted. By the way, I'm an immigrant. I came here when I was 11 years old from Czechoslovakia, which had been taken over by the communists. And my father, who became a professor and was one at home, frankly, also kept saying that he was very concerned that Americans didn't see how fragile democracy was. And at the same time, he'd say that there is such a resiliency in democracy. And I think that we have proven in many ways that democracy is never a done thing, that it is something that is always evolving, and that it is not bad to question, and it is not bad to recognize that it's far from perfect. But I don't think, and this is what has made me nervous over the last year, we can't operate on the basis of the fear factor. If we have to have just one factor, I would operate on the basis of the hope factor. But I really do think it has been a year that has really raked up an awful lot of issues. And some are very dangerous and we need to talk about them. And some really give us an opportunity to see what the major good parts of democracy really are and why it really is resilient.
And if we can talk just briefly, I asked that broad question. There really, in my mind at least, are kind of two aspects of this last year, and one is I think you've described as a more hopeful aspect, and you may disagree with me, but I look at the reawakening on issues of social justice and the rededication of our community to equality of opportunity, to the issues that we've confronted in our country as an opportunity to show the best that America can be. And I also look at, to your point, the fear factor elements of, trying to, in essence, have a pseudo-nationalism that is more divisive than cohesive. How do you see those two sort of strands playing out when you look at other people's views of our country? And do you think one has been dominant over the last year, or do you think they're sort of continuing along on their strangely parallel courses?
Well, I think they are continuing in the strangely parallel. And as you can expect, I spend quite a lot of time talking to foreigners. I created a group of former foreign ministers, and I used to be on the road all the time, but now virtually kind of talking, and they are confused by us, I have to say. And I do think that the job of the Biden administration is one where we have to, with some humility, try to re-explain ourselves and talk about what is healthy in our discussion and what brought it on, and to kind of be open about all of this. But it has been confusing to people. And the last time I was abroad, frankly, was in February last year at something called the Munich Security Meeting, where we were like a joke, frankly. And it was people trying to figure out who we were, why, and really didn't take us seriously. And I think that what we have to do is reintroduce ourselves. And I think that is what we're beginning to do, but it's not going to be simple, because there are still countervailing forces going on, and still, frankly, the recognition by some that the election was stolen and things that don't make any sense, but they are being propagated. And so we need to be aware of the fact that our story requires a renewal.
Again, it's difficult to explain us sometimes. And so, it's funny, of course, foreigners are not the only ones that are sometimes confused about how we can be all of these things at once as a nation. But that's one of the great things about this opportunity to have this discussion, and the folks like the McCain Institute that drive these discussions. Let me touch on something you just mentioned. There's countervailing forces. We are not the only country that is struggling with these sort of aspects of pseudo-nationalism, aspects of increasing disrespect or delegitimizing of democratic institutions. You can see that across the globe in different ways. And one question that I have for you is sort of, do you in fact see that sort of rise of authoritarianism or rise or delegitimizing of democratic institutions in multiple countries? And if so, sort of why do you think it is spreading in a global way instead of being more isolated in different pockets?
Well, if you don't mind, I will sound like a professor and take a little longer to answer that, which
Please.
is that I've talked about the fact that there are two mega trends and their downside. So one mega trend is globalization, and most of us have benefited from it in some particular way of being able to really be a part of a larger world where there's so many things going on. The downside of it, though, is that it's faceless. And we all want to know our identities. Where do we come from? What is our ethnic, religious, etc. background? And that's fine. The only problem is if my identity hates your identity, it leads to nationalism, and hyper-nationalism is very dangerous. So that's one mega trend and its downside. The other one is technology. And one thing that I love to talk about is where it's positive. It's clearly connected us all and been very helpful in many ways. And I love to talk about the Kenyan woman farmer who doesn't have to walk miles anymore to pay her bills. She can do it with a mobile phone and then have a life and either go to school or get a job or run for office or whatever. The downside of it is that it has disaggregated people's voices. So if you talk about the Arab Spring, for instance, people were motivated to come to the Arab Spring, to go to Cairo, to Tahrir Square by social media, and everybody was getting their messages some other way. They get there, they don't have a clue what to do. And I'm always the last one to say this, but the elections there were held too soon. The Muslim Brotherhood was organized and the Tahrir Square people were not, and they had no idea what to do. So then I make up this older guy who is somebody who lives outside of Cairo, who wants to come in and open his stall in the marketplace, and it's a mess. And he says, to hell with this, I want order. And all of a sudden they have a military government or military-led government. And so that is kind of the overall trend. I wrote a book not long ago called Fascism, A Warning, because I did want to figure out what was going on, because there were countries in Europe that, like Hungary and Poland, for instance, wondered why they were doing, or the Philippines in Asia, and or Venezuela, various things that were going on. And it's really very worrisome. And so I did go back in history to figure out where, by the way, people throw the word fascism around without having any idea what it really means. It's not an ideology.
What does it mean? Yeah,
well, I'm getting there. It's not an ideology. It's a way for gaining power. And the first practitioner of it was Mussolini. And what had happened was that Italy had fought on the side of the Allies during World War I, but didn't really get kind of enough gratitude or respect for that. They also were having economic problems. And all of a sudden there was this outsider who spoke well and actually did say in Italian that he was going to drain the swamp. And he exacerbated the differences that existed in the society. And that is the basis of fascism, is to have a leader identify himself with one group at the expense of another. And the other would then be the scapegoats. And the division gets larger and larger. The best quote in that book actually comes from Mussolini, who said, if you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices. So there's been a lot of feather plucking going on. And I think that people don't see when there is this exacerbation of divisions, and then leaders who think that they are above the law and see the press and information as an enemy of the people. And so I decided that it was really important to write a book that was it literally is it's called Fascism, A Warning. Yeah. And I kind of had a to-do list of things that we need to do when we see these kinds of divisions.
Why don't you talk about that to-do list? Because I was going to ask about the to-do list next anyway. I think that a to-do list for Madeleine Albright would do us all well.
Well, I really do think we have to be very conscious of what is going on. And as I said, we can be proud of our identities, but not at the expense of somebody else's. And we can be proud of our country but when nationalism leads to hyper-nationalism, it creates huge problems in terms of how we behave internationally. But I do think so what I think we have to do is be aware that fascism is a way for taking power by dividing society, not unifying it, and therefore exacerbating the problem. And I think we have to call it out, and we have to call out when a leader thinks he's above the law. And definitely we have to make clear that freedom of the press is one of the bases of democracy. There's no question about that. But one of the real parts of the to-do list that is not easy, frankly, is to talk to people with whom we disagree. I deliberately say, and respect them, not tolerate them. Tolerance is usually a word we like, but it's really tolerate, put up with, when I think what we need to do is try to figure out what is motivating them and not just kind of decide that we don't want to talk to them. And that is the major part of the to-do list. And I also do think the following thing. There's no book or speech that's ever given that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So one of the quotes I kind of like is something like, the older I get, the younger are my teachers. And therefore, I do think that the younger generation is one that is now living through extraordinary challenges that need to be already seen as part of the solution of really working in order not to create those divisions, to really see our similarities.
I think that younger generation, I mean, one of the remarkable things about it, I think certainly in the United States, and frankly in the Arab Spring and in many of these other instances, one of the things that both globalization and technology have done, those two mega trends that we are not going to change or slow down, the younger generation just understands them better. They have grown up with a different attitude toward them. And you have seen in the United States that young generation lead this reawakening on social justice. You saw the younger generation in the Middle East, of course, in the Arab Spring, use those technologies to drive what could have been, to your point, a real reawakening there. And that was and remains in Tunisia and some other places. The two sides of those coins are, and I don't ever talk without quoting, and I pronounce his name horribly in my bad English, but Václav Havel, whose greatest prayer for his country was to have faith in the value of our common pursuits. and that is, to me, what you're describing. And one question that I have about these megatrends, and in particular technology, I would love to hear you talk about this briefly, because there are two sides to that technology coin. And one is, how do we, especially in the midst of this pandemic where people are more reliant on technology than ever, what do you see as a way that we can use the technology to bring people together, to introduce them across the lines that you're talking about and reduce division, rather than huddle back among the hyper-nationalist discussions that seem to occur in social media? Do you have any technology prescriptions? Because that's an issue that's a very difficult one for me.
Well, it is a very difficult one because in many ways, it's a neutral tool of some kind, frankly, that can be misused. I mean, one can say, we created Frankenstein or something, but it is clearly something that is very good and very bad at the same time. When I was a real academic, I wrote, and to go back, I'm very glad you talked about Havel, but I wrote my dissertation on the role of the press during the Prague Spring, which was in 1968, before Havel. And what was interesting, communication at that time had been coming into Czechoslovakia through Radio Free Europe, and people kind of knew what the truth was. It just that it could not be published in their newspapers. And so then what happened, censorship was removed temporarily, and then Warsaw Pact countries invaded and it all went away again. I also then decided to study what was going on in Poland in 81 with Wałęsa, where all of a sudden there was a new technical tool, which was he would go to factories, and they had those little micro cassettes, and they would tape what he was saying, and then they'd send the cassette to the next factory so that it multiplied what people knew. So there's always something out there. And I do think that the problem is that we can't be we are the ones that have to master the tool rather than the other way around. And that's where the problem comes in. And the question is, who has access to it? We believe in freedom of the press, and yet there are those who misuse it. And so I do think that what has to happen, frankly, which is hard, is for people that want to get information, they actually have to look at a number of different sources and try to figure out. So it takes work. It isn't just a matter of, turning something on and saying, oh, this is the truth. And it makes me sound very much like a relativist, but it's not easy. And it has become complicated because of this incredible new mechanism. I mean, the idea, frankly, I have, believe it or not, what I do miss is the travel, not so much the airports, but the long flights that allowed me to either sleep or read or watch some movie, and just and yet now I have easier, more contacts with a lot of my foreign friends, and we're getting used to it. It's just that, the problem is I am a total extrovert and you don't get any buzz out of Zooms. But I do think that we need to see the new proximity that could help us understand each other better, but also be vigilant, and that's the word, about how it is misused.
And to me, I mean, number one, I appreciate everything you said about both getting closer and the world shrinking, but also missing out on the quality of those relationships, right? I mean, when the Zoom ends, the Zoom ends. You don't get to have, everybody come around and have your side conversations. And I'm a miserable pandemic worker and everything else. But let me say this about the world shrinking even more, and we'll conclude, I think, with this sort of as we move on to the post-COVID newly even smaller world where we have these opportunities. I think one of the remarkable aspects of this new technology and frankly America's loss of control over sort of its democracy is we are much more willing, I think, to look outside of our country and outside of our small universes for answers. And the Carter Center has observed 110 elections, including including the Egyptian election that you described, in which social media played an enormous role, but also even in Liberia, which is a country that has virtually no infrastructure, one of the lowest infrastructures in the world. But even there, the citizens of Liberia were getting their news about their presidential candidates from Facebook on their phones, right? You're talking about every country in the world confronting a new technology and really having common questions about what it takes for a democracy to be successful. And as we look at what you're talking about in terms of vigilance and what it is that we are teaching ourselves as Americans to preserve our democracy and to teach respect, it seems like we have an opportunity to reach really internationally to suss out some of those democratic ideals and even best practices that are out there. And what do you see sort of on the horizon in this post-COVID world at its most hopeful? In terms of preserving the democratic ideals that we all aspire to?
Well, I do think that the kind of work that the Carter Center has been doing, the kind of work that I'm chairman of the board of the National Democratic Institute, and we do work within the National Endowment for Democracy and with the Republicans. And that is a vehicle that really allows us to go and explain democracy. You can't impose democracy. That's an oxymoron. But what needs to happen is to explain democracy to people and understand that I believe we're all the same, that we want to make decisions about how we run our lives. And then talk to them about what can be done, what the government can do to help. And by the way, I also believe that we need to make sure that people are able to live economically. I mean, they leave their countries because they can't make a living. And so I say democracy has to deliver because people want to vote and eat. And so there has to be a way that the private sector works with the public sector and with great organizations like the Carter Center and really try to sort out. And the McCain, they're a group of organizations that work on this. And I think that we are on the right track, but we also have to recognize that there is another force that is out there. I happen to think communists are also fascists, in terms of using the way to divide people and set people against each other, and who have kind of easy answers. Take my money and I'll build you a road, or and then I'll come and take something from you later. And so I think we have to be on the lookout, and we have to develop kind of a playbook of how we all operate together. I believe that. You haven't asked me about my pin, but I wore it deliberately, and it's "We the People," it says. And I really do think that that is the important part in terms of getting the people of countries to be supportive of the kind of change that allows them then to make decisions and not to be told what to do.
And clearly the ongoing discussion in the United States, the ongoing discussion between the United States and others among those people to help define and understand those fundamental principles of democracy. It's so valuable. You are such an important part of that. The McCain Institute has a great role to play, as I mentioned at the very beginning, along with folks that are now nonpartisan, but who have partisan backgrounds, being able to provide leadership to really bring us together as Americans, and then as global Democrats with a small d. It's a valuable discussion that is required, to your point, to be democratized and to be spread across the world with all of these great tools that we have in a constantly vigilant way. So I agree. It is a great honor for me to be here. If there's anything you want to say in conclusion, please do. But I would just say thank you very much for your time, for participating here with me.
Well, I have enjoyed this very much. And I really do think that what you're doing at the Carter Center is remarkable, and carrying on the legacy of your incredible grandfather, who made such a difference in terms of having America be an example on human rights, and really understanding that we weren't perfect, but that we really do have a very important role to play. And so, and Georgia is certainly leading the way on a lot of very interesting things. So it's been my honor, and I'm delighted anytime you want to talk, Jason.
Thank you so much, Secretary Albright, and thanks again to the McCain Institute.